Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and welcome to episode 13 of GridSchool for Bitwig 3.0. Today we're going to be talking about phase basics and phase shaping. And in fact, we're going to be spending the next 3 episodes after this one also talking about phase and the way phase is very important to a lot of the more useful and interesting things you'll do in the grid. But today we're just going to cover the basics. As with all of the episodes in this series, each new episode builds upon concepts and techniques I've described in earlier episodes. So if you haven't yet discovered this playlist, if you're just dropping in now on episode 13, I recommend you look in the description for a link to this playlist and scroll back and start with episode 1 and work your way up to where we are now. Or some of the things I talk about may not make a whole lot of sense. Okay, so where we left off in episode 12 was, we were showing you this basic technique for running a sequencer in the grid, and we were using the incoming phase signal to drive it. We had a reset trigger to sort of sync up the phase again when we wanted to, like with an incoming node. And it generated a sound. Now, what we're going to do today is start examining this phase portion of everything a little more carefully. And I've got 5 examples that will show you pretty much all the basics about phase you need to understand. Okay, so first off, I've just initialized this instance of Bitwig, so nothing's happening at all. We don't see this dot changing color at all, so there's like no activity in this phase input. It doesn't even see phase coming into this polygrid device yet. There's no activity, no sound, nothing. So the first thing to understand is when you very first set up a brand new polygrid, you kind of need to trigger a voice and make it come alive. So I'm going to just touch a key on my keyboard, and now we can see everything working. What we see is it's reading the incoming phase at 90 BPM. So each one of these lines, these diagonal lines to where it drops down to 0 like that, this represents a bar at 90 BPM at my project tempo. And as this cycles through, whenever it gets to this vertical drop from almost 1 back down to 0 again, or actually it is 1. 1 and 0 are kind of the same. I'll explain that in just a sec. When it hits this vertical mark, that's when it starts the phase over again and starts cycling through our 8-note pattern, or 8 eighth notes per bar. And if I were to toggle this on, we would hear the actual output. So right now it's just a simple 8-bar gate with 8 notes that are all exactly the same. And the first thing to know about phase is that there's the incoming device phase, but if I reset the phase in the middle of the incoming device phase, and this top oscilloscope is showing us it's tapping the incoming device phase from the project. But watch what happens if I trigger a new note in the middle of the phase here somewhere, right here. So now what we're hearing and what we're seeing in the oscilloscopes is the newly re-triggered phase in this bottom oscilloscope. So my reset is no longer in sync with the actual phase that's coming into the polygrid device from the project. And remember, we set the length of that phase in the inspector values for the polygrid window. Okay, right here, 16/16 means that the incoming phase lasts for 1 bar. But this bar here is locked to the project tempo. It's literally like the clock is always running underneath the covers in the project. It's always running under the covers, and if I were to start the play transport, see how when I started the play transport, it re-triggered this top oscilloscope? Watch that again. I'm going to stop transport, wait till it gets halfway up, and then start play again. Every time I start and stop the play transport, the project phase resets from wherever it is. Like you see, I'm just before bar 2 here. So if I were to retrigger, when I retrigger the play button again, it's going to start its phase very close to the top because I'm almost to bar 2 up here. So watch this carefully. I'm going to start way at the bottom. Okay, well actually, it's always restarting from bar 1, so that's why it's starting at the bottom, because of the way I have my thing set up here. But let's put my start cursor here at the third beat of bar 1, so it's 1 beat before bar 2 starts. So let's try that again. Let's come back here to the phase. Now, if I press start even right after the top phase starts, watch where it's going to actually start up about this line here. So let's wait, and boom. See how it started right on the third line, which is the third beat of the bar? One more time. I'm going to start it right here. See how it jumped instantly up to the third beat, finished its phase, and then started over again? Let's go back to the timeline, and let's set this more like here, or, let's put it here. Okay, I'm going to start on the first beat of any bar. Stop the transport, come back in. Let's watch this line. So now no transport's playing, so it's just sort of free running at the phase lock that it left at when I stopped transport. But now as soon as I start the transport, even way up high, it's going to jump down to this first line where the first quarter note is. So start. See how it started right there at that quarter note? So roughly, basically, when you're looking at these phase lines, you can think of, in an oscilloscope, you can think of this first thing, this first horizontal line above the center as beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and back to the start of the next bar, or beat 4. Okay? That's the first trick. The next thing to remember is if you're doing anything to reset the phase, you're going to be unsyncing what's actually going on in the grid from the incoming transport and where it's locked to the project grid, okay, which may or may not be important depending on what you're doing. If you're just in a polygrid device and you're just messing around and you're playing notes and you plan to record notes, it really doesn't matter what the incoming project phase is based on the tempo. But in some cases, it might matter. So just be aware that there's a timing difference here when you start resetting phase inside of a grid device. If you're ever using a reset, you're potentially throwing things out of sync with the grid, the arranger grid here, right? If you use resets, you're no longer keeping your phase in sync with the project grid. Very important to remember, because that will cause you some headaches sometimes if you're not aware of that. Okay, what else? Let's give you a different way of visualizing phase. This is a plugin by Kilohertz called Transgate. And just to sort of demonstrate the way phase works, you can think of it as like the hands on a clock, and every time it reaches 12 o'clock, you're resetting the phase. Now, you can kind of ignore these oscilloscopes. Let's get rid of that one for now. I'm going to try and start this in time. But when I turn on the Transgate, it should, I think I left it to start right here, and it should cycle around, and every time it comes to the top, it should match the phase if I get my timing right. And go. Oh, helps if I press the right button. Let's try that again. Go. All right, well, I clicked a little late, but you can basically see that the speed at which this Transgate is running is pretty equal to the phase up here. And every time the phase hits the top, it's pretty much 12 o'clock up here in the Transgate. Now, this Transgate is also running at a resolution of 1/16th note, and there's 16 steps in it. Does that sound familiar? Because that's exactly the way that we've got the incoming device phase set up over here. So the one useful thing to know about phase is that you can subdivide it or speed it up or slow it down relative to the bars and beats on your grid. So the bars and beats on the grid are running at this tempo right now because it's at a speed of 16/16th notes. If I were to speed this up and say, let's make the resolution of this be 32nd notes instead, you're going to see that now this thing circles through its cycle twice for every time that the phase in the project does one full circle, okay? So this is like a circle wrapping around a clock, and then it goes back to 12, and then it rolls around, it goes back to 12, and then it rolls around and goes back to 12, just like this. But the point is, you can have different things in the project running at different phases, and that's going to be the subject of some of these other episodes, especially episode 16. I'm going to talk about how to subdivide your project into all these different phases to get some interesting half-time, double-time, and polyrhythm stuff going on. But this is just a visual example of phase. So let's move on. Let's go look at this one now. And the next thing you really need to understand, and I touched on this in the last video, but it probably didn't stick and was a little confusing. But in order for phase to work, it needs a voice. And again, I explained in the last video how I have 2 deep dive videos on voice handling. Really, really recommend you watch those videos and really, really wrap your head around voice handling. But just as a quick review, for every kind of device that's an instrument in Bitwig, there's a voice handling section. Right now, this particular polygrid is in a polyphonic mode, right? I've got it up at 9 voices. 10 voices, doesn't matter. It's polyphonic right now. So I can press 3 different keys on my keyboard and all those voices will come in and it will be active. You'll see the MIDI thing here, right? So I've got voices and you saw a couple little triggers, a little blips from the phase, but where's my phase? I'm playing notes. Notes are running through this thing, right? I'm triggering a note and it kicks out one little phase blip, but it doesn't look like the phase diagram we've been seeing, right? It should look like this line right here. We've got this is the phase itself, and here's that same diagonal line showing the phase cycle over 90 BPM, 1 bar at 90 BPM, right? That's what's coming out of here. You can see the little purple dot filling up as it gets close to the top. You can see that it's coming into this oscilloscope, but where's the line? And why isn't this value showing us anything? Well, the reason is because everything inside the grid needs a voice to live and be active. Yes, I've got incoming phase, but nothing else is really going to work because there's no voices actually alive and active. And we can see that by looking at this active voices line in the voice handling thing. So I said in the last video, the real trick to using anything that's like sequenced or phase related, where you want some sequencer inside the grid to be putting out gates and making things happen, you have to go to true mono. Well, look, the instant I turn on true mono, we start seeing a phase line. And we can see the value going from 0 to 1, and then when it gets to 1, it pops back out to 0 again and just keeps going like a clock face. But it doesn't work when you're in digimono or when you're in a polyphonic mode. Now, why is that? It's because in digimono and in polyphonic mode, you need to manually activate a voice somehow, and that's usually done with an envelope. So if I were to turn on this gate module and press a key, again, the gate sort of looks like it's stuck in this open state, but there's still no voice. There's no voice because all the voices in a grid device, or especially a polygrid device anyway, the voices are usually controlled by an envelope, and I have to enable some sort of envelope and then hold down a key. And as long as I'm holding down a key, and you can see the little white dot that jumps up through the envelope here, when I hold the key down, the white dot stays up here at its max value after the attack. And when I let go of the note, it drops down and releases. And you'll notice that as soon as the voice releases and goes away, because we're in digimono, so digimono will kill off the voice after 10 milliseconds because of this thing here. It's going to kill off that voice 10 milliseconds after it reaches the end of its envelope. So I turn this on, I let it go, and the voice dies. And when the voice dies, there's no more phase. It's not really coming into the grid anymore. It just stops right here and is blocked. So I think the easiest way to think of this whole voice versus phase thing, think of voices as like threads in a computer process. You can't run logic and do things unless there's a thread in the processor that's alive to do that processing. So kind of, sort of, kind of, in the sense of the grid, your voices are your threads in which your grid process can run, and phase is intimately tied to that. No voice, no phase. As soon as you bring a voice alive, you got phase. Kill the voices off so there's no voices left, you have no more phase. And that's true in polyphonic mode too, because in polyphonic mode, even though I'm holding down 3 different voices right now, as soon as I let one of them go, we've still got a voice alive, but look, boom, right? Because it's a long story. So the moral of the story is true mono when you really need to do things with phase. That's why the default for the grid is true mono. If you're really going to do a lot of phase manipulation for sequencing and stuff, you need a voice active, and true mono is the easiest way to make sure that happens. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. Another interesting way of looking at phase and understanding phase is to use a cool trick that Bitwig just put out a video yesterday, in fact. Bitwig themselves, Dave Linenbank, the tech writer, and the person who does all the demos at shows and stuff. And sorry, Dave, if you're also a programmer, I'm sorry if I missed that point. But anyway, this video called Modular Concepts, Phase, A Matter of Timing. It's a 12-minute video, and Dave shows some interesting features about phase, and he shows phase in an interesting way. And one of the things he shows in this video, I highly recommend you watch it, is he shows this trick for showing phase, demonstrating phase as kind of a ruler of things. So what we have here is we've got phase coming into oscilloscope, and that's on the purple top part of the graph. Then we're using a triggers module, which is from the where are you? The data group? Yeah, the data group. This was the one I didn't talk about yesterday. So we've got a triggers module in here, and it's by default, it reads the incoming device phase. That's why this precord is on. If I turn this off, it stops doing anything. But if I turn it on so it's listening to the device phase, it's set up right now to put out one trigger per phase cycle. That's what triggers does. It's like, how many triggers do you want during each full cycle of the phase? And I'm using a gate length module from the logic group. Yeah, this one here. Gate length is turning that trigger very short. If I push this up to a longer gate, like, that, you're going to see that when where are you? Yeah, there we go. You can see that the gate now is held open for a little bit of time. And if I push it open a little more, now it's held open for longer. But the trick is to set this to a very short gate, a very short trigger gate, so that it's just this tiny little trigger blip, boom, okay? And then we're running into a mixer and making it much quieter than usual, so it's a short little line. And then finally, we're putting it into a math module called subtract, and we're basically saying flip it negative by subtracting it from 0. Like, this value is normally plus 25% or whatever, but if you subtract 0 minus, the inverse of that, you end up with it upside down like this. So it's just a convenient way to see where every phase starts and stops. Now, we can do a further trick where we highlight these two modules, and I hold down Control and grab, and it turns into a plus sign. So I drag them down here and copy them. Then I run this into the mixer. It uses the same value as we had. And now I'm going to set this value to 4 triggers per phase cycle. And now we're seeing quarter notes. Quarter, 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 start a bar, quarter, 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 start a bar. And because these two trigger values are summing together at the start of the bar where they sync up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Because they're summing together, they're twice as long. Okay, and if we do this one more time, Control, drag, Let's set this to 16 for 16th notes. And now all of a sudden we see what looks like the grid in your arranger view, where you've got a long tick where each bar starts, slightly longer ticks, or shorter ticks rather, where the quarter notes are, and then you've got these short ticks showing you the 16th notes. All right, so just an interesting trick. Maybe you can find this useful. In fact, some of us have been experimenting with using this type of trigger system to create polyrhythms. Because, for example, if I set n to 5, so that there's a mixture of whole note beats, pentuplets. Yeah, I think it's quintuplets for 5, and then 16th notes. Now we've got these triggers that are happening at polyrhythms. Maybe I could set this to something like 5/8, right? And so we've got interesting polyrhythm triggers here, which can be used for all sorts of things. But anyway, let's move on to the next one. Okay. So now that you understand what phase looks like and how it acts, we're going to go back to this basic thing. So here's our basic pattern again. I'm using the gates module in a triggered mode, and I've got a little bit of a pitch pattern, so this is what it sounds like. And I have a reset on the phase so that every time I press a note, it starts over from the beginning, even if it was way across in its phase, right? Pressing notes, restarting it, right? And because I have the pre-chord for pitch on in the triangle, as I explained in the last video, it is using these as semitones to modify whatever note is coming into the grid. So depending on what key I hit, this is sort of the root note of the key that I'm hitting, and then these are semitone jumps around that key. All right, so the first thing to know about phase is you can mess with it. And when you mess with the phase, you're basically warping time, because phase at its heart is the amount of time it takes to complete one cycle of something. So most of the time your phase is related to one bar at your project tempo. That's a cycle. Every bar is a cycle. And how long does it take to complete that bar? Well, you can mess with the incoming phase in various ways to change or subdivide or warp that time. So the first and most interesting way to warp it is with the bend module. And I'm not going to cover all these modules. I'm just going to show you a few to give you some ideas of what you can do with phase. So right now, it's linear, just like our oscilloscope. Let's drag this out and make this really, really, really clear. Yeah, let's put you there, and let's put you there. And I'm going to make these slightly different colors, and it's kind of crawling up slowly in a line because I need to slow down the oscilloscope as slow as possible. And I'm going to do the trick I talked about long time ago in another episode, where I'm going to use something neutral like, gain dB or attenuate or whatever. I'm going to put a little thing here and use this to change its color. All right. So right now, because both of these, the phase coming out of reset and the phase coming out of bend are exactly identical, they're covering each other up, and the green line is just taking precedence. But now watch what happens when I drag this line, bend this line. I'm just going to click and drag it. Now what I've done is I have literally changed the phase speed. The green line now goes up faster at the start and then slows down near the end of the phase. The phase is still starting and stopping at exactly the same point, but I'm changing the timing of it. And if you pay attention to what's happening down here, you can see it moves really fast through the first few notes, but then it slows down for the last notes. And let's hear what it sounds like. Where's my sound? There we go. Let's make that a little less drastic. Right? I'm changing the timing of the cycle. Let's slow it down in the other direction. We'll make it slow at first and then speed up at the end. Okay, so we've taken what was normally a linear, straight, clock-shaped timing, and now we're warping it. We're warping the time. We're bending the time, and this green curve is showing us how we're warping it. It should move upward at a constant rate, but it's not anymore. It's moving upward more slowly at first and more quickly towards the end of the curve. So that's what bend does, for example. And all these other phase modules mess with this in similar ways. Another interesting module is reverse. Let's just drag reverse on top of bend and let go. And now you can see the phase of my devices is running backwards because we've taken the incoming phase and we've said just reverse it. So the green line is now starting at the top and going to the bottom. At the same line, the incoming purple phase is starting at the bottom and moving to the top. So it's now backwards. Oh, let's get tricky. Let's add a bend to that. Let's bend it a little bit. Right? Okay, so this is probably giving you some ideas already. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about all of the modules. Some of these are a little more advanced sound design tricks. Let's look at the sine mod. Let's put sine mod here. Let's get rid of the bend. Let's try and get rid of the bend. There you go. Okay, delete. So sine mod right now, it's neutral and it's just letting the phase run normally. So you can see that both of my lines are exactly identical. The green's overlapping the purple. And it sounds like this. But now if I mess with the sine mod, what it basically tries to do is impose a sine shape on top of the phase. If I move it up just a little bit, you can see how it's turning that straight line into a little more of a sine wave, which sounds like this. So just like an oscilloscope, kind of an LFO type wave, it goes faster, then slows down in the middle, then faster again in the opposite direction. So it's going faster, kind of neutral, slowing down, and then going faster again. So you get this hump. If I keep pushing this up, it starts folding. See how I'm getting a fold kind of behavior in there, like wave folding? And it's doing the same exact thing to the phase. And now look at how this crazy thing is jumping backward and forward now at different rates, depending on which direction the phase lines are. And this is what it sounds like. Now it's very fast, so we could try and slow it down a little bit. Okay, so you may or may not find that useful for certain things. There's ways to scale this down. You have a plus minus button that will change its behavior a little bit. Like when it's in this mode here with the minus sign or the plus sign turned off, we get this back and forth behavior. Okay, but the basic idea is some of these phase devices will effectively shape the wave, and here's how you can see what the shape is doing if the device itself doesn't show you. You can use incoming versus shaped trick like this to see what's happening. Now, some of the other phase devices are more specific. We've already talked about reset and what it's good for. I'm not going to talk about phaser until episode 19. Because that's a very special kind of phase device. So I'm going to hold off on that one. Scalar basically reshapes the incoming phase signal. So right now, what we're doing with scalar, you can see it's set to a default value of 1.02, which means it's effectively continually slowing down the phase. The phase is now running slower in this kind of linear way. Let's put it back to 1, exactly 1, and let's hit a note to reset. So yeah, this is, you're gonna have to read up on this and decide what it's doing. You can control the ratio, but the basic idea is that it's constantly different, and you can make the change. You can make the phase faster and shorter. You can make the change the phase shorter and longer. Let's reset it. Okay, so now it's taking longer. So you can do these very precise differences in phase. And so, for example, you could kind of use a modulator to warp it up and down and see this little sort of pseudo weird warping bending shape that I'm doing just by speeding it up and slowing it down. And, that could sound like this. All I'm doing is just changing the rate of the scalar. Okay, so that's an interesting one. Reverse wrap. Wrap is kind of special purpose. I'm not going to talk about that one. And the rest of these, wrap and lag and mirror and skew and sync, these are more common for specific sound design usages, kind of advanced sound design cases. So I'm going to leave it up to you to explore those other ones and see what they do. Now, counter is an interesting one. Counter basically takes the incoming phase and divides it into it'll send out a trigger kind of sort of at the end of the phase. Let's see if we can set this up real quick, because I do need to move on to the last example. Actually, I'm going to leave a counter for you to explore on your own, but it's a lot like any counter thing. At the top of its cycle, every 8 things or every 4 things, it's going to trigger or do something. So that's what counter is about. Let's go on to the last example, because I don't want to keep you too long. The last thing to understand about phase, we talked early on in this series about oscillators phase modulating other oscillators. So here's a typical example of a sawtooth. And if I connect up a sine wave and do some shaping to it and then connect it to the phase input port of the sawtooth, right? We're doing typical FM, which is really incorrectly named. It's really PM for phase modulation. That's what these input ports on the oscillators are meant for. They're meant to have the phase of the wave shape, which in this case, here's the basic sawtooth wave shape, and its phase starts here and ends here. And that's, at whatever hertz speed of your notes, it's your incoming notes that control how rapidly these cycles run. So the speed of the cycles is really controlled by the MIDI notes that are incoming to the oscillator. And the total length here is the length of a full phase at that speed controlled by your MIDI note. Now, oscillators and the phase in oscillators is really meant to be manipulated at audio rate speeds by another oscillator, right? That's running at audio rate. You might be tempted to think, well, this is a purple port, right? So why can't I take a phase device and maybe, let's take the incoming phase from the project and hook it up here. And let's crank this all the way to the top, and hey, it doesn't do anything. Well, that's because it's really counting on its phase for the length of this waveform to be based on the MIDI note, not this type of phase. So, it's not doing anything because it's just neutral. If you were to use one of the phase things like bend, and put this here and say, well, let's bend the phase and see what happens. Well, you're getting a little bit of effect, but it's slow. It's much slower than audio rate, so it's not really doing anything interesting. Let's try the sine mod. Let's get rid of the bend. Let's try sine mod. See, we're not really getting anything interesting because these are static shaping tools and they're slower than audio rate. So the main point of this last bit is the phase tools are really for modulating sequencing. If you've got certain things happening at a certain timing, the phase tools adjust that timing, like mostly for sequenced stuff, sequenced data. These things up here, this is what the phase tools were really designed for, was manipulating this group. So these two groups are right next to each other because this is a generator, and these are generators or shapers that are intricately tied to the data modules, and they control the speed at which the data modules work. They control the timing, the warping, the triggering, and so on. So these phase modules, even though they're purple and the input port on oscillators is purple, don't think that it's really that useful to drive these into oscillators. And that's the last thing I wanted to show you today. Thanks for hanging with me, and I'll see you next time.